All right, so today we are looking at 8.3, which is the lymphatic system and immunity. All right, so there's bacteria everywhere, contagious bacteria and viruses. So it's the human immune system that protects our body against these pathogens. So the lymphatic system, it's a network of vessels that contain interstitial fluid, and then the blood and the lymph work together to fight infection as well as transport fats. All right, so here we're just looking at water in North America. We have water treatment plants that eliminate harmful waterborne bacteria and parasites that may be present in natural water. And then UV light is also used to kill organisms in the water. Chemicals are also added, like chlorine, added to the water to kill microorganisms. But the levels of those chemicals are not harmful to the overall health of humans. And so your lymphatic and immune systems will use processes to remove any harmful substances to prevent us from being ill. So only harmful invaders or dead cells are recognized and destroyed by our body. So what we're going to look at is how does the human body determine its response to invading substances. All right, so this diagram is just showing the lymphatic circulatory system. It's a network of vessels with associated glands or nodes, and they extend throughout the body. And the lymphatic system is going to work with the white blood cells to protect against pathogens. And you may have noticed sometimes a swollen lymph nodes, for example, like under the jaw or armpits. They can sometimes be painful, and it's an indicator that the body is fighting an infection. All right, this system also plays a critical role in the maintenance of the body's fluid and osmotic balance. It's very similar to the venous portion of the circulatory system. It's a network of one-way vessels that collects the fluid that leaks from the capillaries into the interstitial space between cells. There's no central pump to circulate this fluid. It relies on movement and skeletal muscles in the body to transport this fluid. All right, so like I said, it's a network of vessels. There's glands or nodes that extend throughout the body. And there's a fluid called lymph. So that's what these lymphatic vessels collect. This fluid called lymph, which is made up of interstitial fluid. It's usually colorless or pale yellow, and it's similar to the plasma of blood. All right, so this system helps to maintain the balance of fluids in the body. As blood circulates through the body, some of the plasma escapes from the capillaries and becomes part of the interstitial fluid that constantly bathes all the cells of the body. And then therefore, rather than re-entering the capillaries of the cardiovascular system, much of that interstitial fluid gets absorbed by the vessels of the lymphatic circulatory system. Eventually, it rejoins the main circulatory system through ducts that empty into the large veins near the heart. All right, and notice here, lymphatic vessels also contain valves, just like veins do, to prevent backflow of the fluid. All right, so this is just a diagram showing the lymph vessels in the green color. The red here is showing an artery. This area here is showing the capillary, this purplish color, and then the blue shows the vein. So we can see here that lymph vessels are very closely associated with the capillaries of the cardiovascular system. And fluid that escapes from the cardiovascular capillaries forms part of the interstitial fluid. Some of that fluid gets collected in the lymphatic capillaries, and then eventually will return to the blood. All right, and here again, this is a lymph vessel. Here is interstitial fluid, and this is showing probably an artery or vein. So again, the lymphatic system has an important role in maintaining correct water balance in the interstitial fluid. And we can see there's this relationship between the lymphatic system, the circulatory system, and the interstitial fluid. All right, next, the lymphatic system also works with the white blood cells to protect the body against infection. So those white blood cells are called lymphocytes. They mature in the lymph nodes and the glands in the lymph nodes, which are the glands that are found throughout the lymphatic system. And these lymph nodes contain macrophages, which we'll take a look at. They trap and destroy bacteria that are circulating within the body. If there's an infection, it may cause your immune system to increase in the number of macrophages and lymphocytes in the lymph nodes. And when you become ill, sometimes you can feel the swelling in the lymph glands in certain areas like the jawbone or under your arms. All right, so the defense system, the human body defends itself against constant attack of pathogens because there's bacteria everywhere. So the human body defends itself against the constant attack of pathogens by either preventing the entry of them or destroying them if they do enter. So there's three groups that we can divide these defenses into. There's the barriers to keep pathogens out. There's the general or non-specific defenses against a wide variety of pathogens. And then there's specific defenses against particular pathogens. All right, so first we'll look at the barriers. So first is the skin. It prevents the entry of pathogens. So it's the first line of defense are all the physical and chemical barriers of the body. So like your eyelashes, the cilia of the respiratory tract, the tears you produce in your eyes, that strong stomach acid in our stomachs. Those are all examples of first lines of defense. The largest barrier is the skin, our outer layer of skin. It's dry and it contains large amounts of tough, relatively indigestible keratin. There's also oils, skin oils, that contain bactericides. Also, our sweat or perspiration forms an acidic layer that is inhospitable for microbial growth. Okay, next we'll look at non-specific defenses or cell-mediated immunity. This is the second line of defense. The non-specific defense, it includes three types of white blood cells, the macrophages, the neutrophils, and the monocytes. The neutrophils and monocytes, they're white blood cells that kill bacteria using phagocytosis. This is a process in which they ingest the bacteria. Macrophages, they develop from monocytes and they also use phagocytosis. And these are found in the liver, spleen, brain, in the lungs, and they circulate in the blood and in the interstitial fluid. Non-specific defense includes natural killer cells, which target body cells that have become cancerous or infected by viruses. And specific defenses are called antibody-mediated immunity. This is the third line of defense, which is immunity. It's developed by the actions of the specific defenses using antibodies. So antibodies, these are the proteins that are able to recognize foreign substances and then they act to neutralize them or destroy them. So each person develops their own unique immune system and in its ability to deal with a wide variety of possible infections. All right, and the reason being is we're not all exposed to the same diseases, and there's also variations in our genetic makeup. All right, so those lymphocytes are divided into two specialized groups depending on where they get matured. So B lymphocytes are called B cells, and they mature in the bone marrow. So that's one way to remember. The B, they mature in the bone marrow. The T lymphocytes or T cells, they mature in the thymus gland located near the heart. And next we're going to talk about antigens. So these are molecules that are found on the surface of the cells and on pathogens like bacteria. And these antigens are what provide an identification system. So antigen receptors on T and B cells, allow them to recognize foreign antigens and then begin the response to the invasion. And then antibodies have the same shape as the antigen receptor for a specific antigen. That way they can bind and neutralize the antigen. So let's take a look at this diagram here. So in A, pathogens have breached the first line of defense, so let's say the skin, and they're going to trigger the body's immune response. So the second line of defense is the arrival of non-phagocytic leukocytes at the infection site, and they're going to release histamine. It's going to cause the blood vessels at the site to dilate, become more permeable to fluid and leukocytes. Increased blood flow and accumulation of fluid makes the area swollen and hot. Increase in temperature alone sometimes may be enough to destroy or neutralize some pathogens. Next, in B, so right here, we have the phagocytic macrophages. So here we can see it's engulfing the bacteria, right? It's kind of like wrapped itself around it. So it's engulfing and it's going to destroy that invading bacteria. The accumulation of dead macrophages and bacteria, that is usually visible as pus at the site of the infection. All right, so which is right here is like pus. Next is C. So in part C here, this is the third line of defense begins after a pathogen has been destroyed. The antigens from the pathogen protrude now from the cell membrane of the macrophage. So we can see them sticking out of the macrophage. These green parts that are sticking out on this macrophage, those are the antigens that came from the pathogen. They are not protruding from the cell membrane of the macrophage. Next, D, receptor sites on the surface of helper T cells are going to bind to the antigens on the surface of the macrophage. And that union triggers the release of chemical messengers from both cells. This causes T cells to multiply, and some of these T cells will destroy the infected tissue cells, breaking the reproductive cycle of the pathogen. All right, that's shown in D, that's the T cell. And E, the antibodies on B cells bind to the antigens and contributing to the destruction of the pathogens. And then F, T cells bind to the B cell antibody antigen complex, and this union activates the B cell, causing it to enlarge, divide. It produces plasma cells and memory cells. The plasma cells will produce more antibodies, about 2,000 per second, and release them into the bloodstream. Then antibodies and memory B cells will remain in the blood, and they're ready to fight a new infection by the same pathogen. So if the same pathogen enters, this time there's antibodies already in the blood and memory B cells. So if there was a new infection, they would be prepared to fight that right away. So most antibodies are specific. So they bind with only one type of antigen, and different B cells produce different antibodies. And this variation increases the possibility that the body will have an antibody that can recognize and bind to an invading pathogen. And once a B cell is activated, it enlarges and divides to produce the memory B cells and the plasma cells. Plasma cells will then produce enormous quantities of the same antibody carried by the B cell and release them into the bloodstream to fight the invading pathogens. And then after the infection has been fought off, it's the memory B cells that remain in the blood, and they're ready to trigger another immune response if that pathogen were ever to come into the body again. Here in this diagram, we can see that each type of antibody will combine with only the appropriate antigen, right? So they have bonding or binding sites. So this one here is different to the binding site to this one. So this one is showing circular shape, but this one is showing triangular shape. So different types of antibodies. All right, so this is just another diagram showing the immune system and how it recognizes harmful antigens. So here we have a bacterium, it enters the body, so it's past the first line of defense. Those are the markers, those red antigen markers, and the blue part is the bacterium, so it's invading. Here comes the macrophage. It's going to engulf the bacterium. It's going to push the antigen markers to its outer membrane of the macrophage. So you can see it's pushed out here. You can see them here as well. Then helper T cells identify the antigen present on the cell membrane of the macrophage. And the B cell identifies the blueprint of the antigen marker, and it's going to start making those antibodies. And then here are the antibodies shown, those Y-shaped. They are going to attach to the antigens, and which will lead to the destruction of the bacteria. Okay, T cells and cellular immunity. Cellular immunity, there are several different types of T cells that will work together to fight off invading pathogens. And then when a pathogen is destroyed by phagocytosis, antigens from the pathogen move to the surface of the macrophage that destroyed it. The helper T cells are the ones that recognize the antigen. They give off the chemical signals that stimulate the action of macrophages, B cells, and other T cells. The killer T cells are the cytotoxic T cells. These are the ones that are going to bind with the infected cells and destroy them, usually by puncturing a hole in their cell membranes. Killer T cells, they might be activated indirectly by the chemical signals from the helper T cell or directly by the presence of the invading pathogen and its antigen. Next, suppressor T cells are the ones that are going to slow and suppress the process of cellular immunity to ensure that normal tissue does not get destroyed. Some T cells don't respond to the invading antigens the first time they're exposed to them. And then it's the memory T cells that will remain in the bloodstream afterwards, and they're able to act quickly if that antigen is encountered again. So if the bacteria with that antigen enters again, they'll be able to lead to an immune response much more quickly. All right, so this is just, again, reviewing the first line of defense, like the skin, tears, eyelashes, mucus, the stomach acid, and so on. The second line of defense, like we talked about, the macrophages and other phagocytotic cells, which will engulf the invading pathogens. That's a non-specific defense. It's the cell-mediated immunity. So it includes the neutrophils, the monocytes, and T cells. T cells that are involved in the cell-mediated or non-specific immune response are specialized to perform a number of functions. So like I talked about, the helper T cells, the killer T cells, the suppressor T cells, and then the memory T cells. They all have those specific roles. Let's see here, the third line of defense. The third line of defense is the antibody-mediated immunity. This is when antibodies in the bloodstream have already been produced, and now these antibodies will recognize foreign substances and act to neutralize or destroy them. So like we saw before, they are Y-shaped molecules, and it's the amino acid sequence in the tips of the Y that varies greatly among different antibodies. All right, that makes the antibody specific for a particular antigen. And how do antibodies contribute to immunity? So there's these three ways. One, they can prevent pathogens from entering or damaging cells by binding to antigens. So basically, antibodies will bind to surface antigens on an invading bacterium, which will prevent the bacteria from entering and damaging healthy cells. Antibodies can also attract macrophages to engulf and destroy the bacterium. And thirdly, the antibody may stimulate a response. This is where the granulocytes, the basophils, eosinophils, and neutrophils, they'll release their toxic granules, and killer T cells will release toxic molecules, which will ultimately result in the destruction of that bacteria. Symptoms of this kind of reaction include like swelling, fever, pus, redness, which indicates infection. Symptoms of infections also indicate that the immune system is working to regain homeostasis. All right, so just a summary again, the body's lines of defense. We have the first barriers, then we have our leukocytes, or white blood cells produced in the bone marrow, phagocytosis of microbes is one of the main methods used by certain leukocytes. Tissue damage due to a physical injury can initiate an inflammatory response. It's a non-specific immune response. It results in swelling, redness, heat, and pain. And then we have antibodies, which can attach to foreign antigens like microbes, and then the antibody is specific and will only bind to its complementary antigen. All right, here in this table is again just showing those lymphocytes we talked about, the helper T cells, which act as sentries to identify foreign invading substances, the B cells, which will start producing the antibodies, the killer T cells, which will puncture cell membranes of infected cells and kill the cell, the suppressor T cells, which will eventually turn off the immune system, and then the memory B cells, which will keep that information about the shape of the antigen.